Welcome to This Week in Habsland. We are Jordan and Brian. We are here for the second part of our draft night coverage. Brian, the Canadiens with the number 21 picked Michael Hage, committed to Michigan University in the upcoming season, played in the USHL, 6'1" center, and judging by the interview he did with Jeff Merrick, it felt like a bit of an emotional moment, and you couldn't be happier for this kid, right?
Absolutely. It's a very, very heartwarming story. Michael grew up a Montreal Canadiens fan. Both his parents being Montreal Canadiens fans, coming from the city of Montreal. He grew up in Toronto, but they did not cheer for the Leafs. They cheered for the Montreal Canadiens, and he looked like he could not be prouder to be a Montreal Canadian. At the end of the questions that he was asked, it looked as though he was looking down at the monitor that was showing the camera on him, and he's just staring at himself in a Habs jersey, and it looked like he couldn't believe it, like so proudly.
Quite possibly for the first time, like when he got picked, he obviously he probably didn't see himself. Probably wasn't until that moment where he just saw himself with the Habs jersey on. This is kind of reminiscent to PK Subban, who also grew up in Toronto, yet grew up a Montreal Canadiens fan. So there's a nice little connection there. So what can we say about Michael Hage? He is not the flashiest player, and there's obviously he falls to 21, or maybe not falls to 21. He was mocked right in around this area. He has lots of potential on the offensive side, was getting better defensively over the second half of his season. Physical play is getting better, and I think the interesting thing about him is kind of maybe a little bit lower stakes, maybe because he was playing in the USHL, but was also a bit of a, not necessarily a late riser, because I think his draft stock kind of remained the same, but he did have a much stronger second half of his season this past year. So I think the Canadiens, they have a really interesting player who is not afraid to drive inside, is able to play make, and is growing in other factions of his game that maybe coming into the season were not necessarily strengths, or maybe even quite below average, and are now at least average, or if not better than that.
Yeah, he has already improved a lot. You're absolutely right. And he's going to have a couple more years to do that as he spends the next 2 years in college. So while he's there, he can get stronger. He can get bigger, fill out. He can learn to play more physically. He can cut to the net more and more, improve all the other things that he does already so well. You mentioned the playmaking. One thing he does really well is a half-wall playmaker on the power play, and that's a really nice added bonus. We talked about already last episode about how Demidov will fill out that first power play unit. Hage might start filling out the second in a few years. So that's a really, really exciting thing. And to make another connection sort of between those two, or a distinction, I suppose, where Demidov is that cycle chance generator, Hughes and Gorton and basically the whole drafting squad here are showing that they're interested also in versatility on offense, because Hage is very much a rush offense creator. He's a wizard on the rush. So adding these two players who both are able to score a lot, produce tons of offense, and do so in different ways, I think is excellent for the versatility of the offense of the Montreal Canadiens moving forward, and it's something that we desperately needed, I think.
So what I also like with the Hage pick is that it definitely is a bit of a swing. In no real way that any other Montreal Canadiens pick in the Hughes-Gorton era, at least a high leverage one. I recognize Lane Hudson is a bit of a swing, but when it's late in the second round, there's not as much value to that pick going into it. You looked at Slavkovsky, there was a bit of a certainty in there. Same goes for Reinbacher. We've talked about Demidov. We will keep talking about Demidov. Like those guys, there was some certainty to it. Philip Machar, I don't remember that feeling like a big swing when it happened. It was just kind of we think he's skilled, we think he's good. I do think, not that Hage is necessarily boom or bust, because there's definitely a universe where the high-end skill doesn't continue to develop, and he becomes a fairly solid third-line checking center. But I think this is the right play. Like, with the forwards that the Canadiens have, who are 24 and under at this point, Hage is the right guy to kind of slot in and just kind of forget for 2 years. And with all the NCAA Rutger McGroarty stuff going on right now, it's kind of neat that he grew up a Habs fan, so there's like a little extra certainty maybe to him, like definitely coming back, and maybe 2 years at Michigan before he comes into the fold and does the old, the Lane Hudson, Sean Farrell thing, where plays a game or two and then spends D+3, that would be, in Laval. So very patient with this guy. Just kind of like enjoy the moment. Like, apparently he was doing an interview with Tevez and he speaks French, which is
bonus. Yeah. That's
so
great.
love the pick. Enjoy it. It seems like a really heartwarming story. And then just kind of, shut your mind off to it and forget about him for about 18 to 24 months because I think it's going to take a lot of time. There's going to need to be a lot of patience. Very much like Beck and Machar and Lane Hudson to an extent. Take our time on this guy. I think it's going to be a worthwhile gamble.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we'll have somebody very, very fun to talk about when we do our prospect coverage over the course of next season and the season after, Jordan, where very often we'll talk about a particular prospect, and I think Hage is going to make that list several times. And on the topic of him being psyched to be a Montreal Canadien and to be drafted by this club, the feeling is absolutely mutual. Well, first of all, by the fans. I mean, I can already see on the socials everybody's freaking out to have gotten this guy at 21. They're thrilled. But also Hughes, who was asked about it, and he said this was the player that he had in mind when they made the trade. So it's basically the 26th, the late second, and a 7th to move up and guarantee that you get Hage, this dynamic offensive player. So I couldn't be happier with this. The fan base couldn't be happier with this. I think Hage couldn't be happier with this. It's just I feel like this is a perfect storm of happiness for the Montreal Canadiens today. There's no ambivalence in my mind. There's no fear in my mind about any of these. Like, so far, so good. I told you earlier as we were just sort of chatting during the draft, like 2022 seemed to be the year where rounds 2 through 7 were just tons of gems in there. The Canadiens got away with murder in those rounds with Beck and Hudson, etc. And the first round great, obviously, as well. Slavkovsky, Machar, that's great too. But I asked you, I sort of thought like today is where the first round kind of shines. We got Demidov dropping from what we think is 2 down to 5, and then Hage probably right where he belongs in the around 20, but the perfect player to be picked at 20.
Yeah, I think it's maybe they weren't anticipating Cole Yzerman sitting there one pick ahead of them at 20 and hoping that he would fall down to 21. But I think, and part of me is like when Ken Hughes said that about that's the guy that they like. What else is he supposed to say about wanting to trade up? But part of me does believe him that they identified him as a guy that they want to take at 26, and the opportunity presented itself to move up a few picks. And I don't think they thought that Yzerman might have been there as well.
Exactly.
And I do think they would have taken Yzerman if he was still available at 21. But I think it's like almost the original plan A of going with Hage.
Yeah.
They were just like, great, we're good with that too.
Which kind of amazing. I mean, you going in thought there's no way that the Islanders are going to be picking Yzerman with the 20th pick just because of the way that they draft. And then it feels maybe like they make that pick and now they can make as many high floor picks as they want and no one can say anything. As you go, why are you making so many high floor picks? Hey, we picked Yzerman. So he sort of has Lou has a clean slate for the future, an argument to make. Yeah,
that pick was as Yzerman was falling, it was kind of I really did assume that Lamoriello tends to pick low ceiling, high floor players, and I don't think that defines Cole Yzerman at all. But maybe he lost this debate, and he probably trusted his scouts that said you gotta take Cole Yzerman. We have him ranked 12, 13.
Right.
So I guess maybe to wrap up on Hage, you should mention that he suffered a torn labrum in September 2022. So his D-1 year was mostly lost. He did come back. It was in the preseason where he got hurt. Did come back, had not a slow ending to the season, but definitely had a slow start to this 2023-2024 season. Had his play pick up, and I really do think, very much how we talked about Beckett Seneca picking up pace in the second half of the season, or same goes for Tisha Ginla probably. Hage had a similar trajectory. I just find it so hard sometimes to assess the non-US NTDP USHL players, and I know that's a lot of acronyms. What I'm trying to say, so he played in the USHL, which is essentially a kind of a corollary to the CHL in the United States, but not necessarily because once you're 18 you go to the universities, right? The U.S. men's national development team, so where Cole Caulfield played and where Cole Yzerman played this past season, and Will Smith and Ryan Leonard all played this previous season. The U.S. team plays with all those teams and just kind of wallops all of them. but these other teams do exist. And so we were talking earlier as well, because when Sacha Boisvert, who also plays in the USHL, he got taken, a few picks before the Habs pick. Hage did the same thing. Canadian player, again, interestingly, Canadian player playing in the US programs. It's always hard to figure out these USHL teams. Him going to Michigan, I think, is going to be a really nice step. I think it's a kind of a perfect program. They had great success with an 18-year-old center 2 years ago, and Adam Fantilli. I'm obviously not comparing the two, but just Michigan has a nice track record with freshman centers that have lots of skill and size. So again, it was such a nice pick. We were getting so excited for the potential for Cole Yzerman, but we were saying as it was happening, if it wasn't going to be Yzerman, Hage and Greentree were the other two guys, and they picked up Hage. So full marks, Kent Hughes. They did a good job. They seem to be done for the night. So great first round.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the interview, he said he's definitely done. He was asked, "What else are you cooking?" And he's got nothing on the stove. That's about it for tonight, which is good enough in my book. Demidov, Hage, I am absolutely thrilled with both of these. There is maybe a slight question mark that you'll see in some of the scouting about whether in the NHL he'll pan out as a center or whether he'll pan out more as a winger. Either way, he's highly skilled, so I don't think it's a big issue. But if he does pan out as a center, the other thing that this does in terms of the depth chart of the Montreal Canadiens is Nick Suzuki's your number one center. That's sort of a given. Doc has this asterisk that we've talked about, which is the injuries. So can he come back from those? And now having Hage is just sort of like a safety net of a second line center / winger / third line center. Like his floor is high enough that I think he'll have an NHL role in the top 9. And if he's good enough and able to continue his great transition play into higher levels and be that dynamic rush creator that he is, and also learn how to score on cycle chances even more, he could be a great center in the 2 spot for the Montreal Canadiens. So this sort of begs the question, have they just filled out the top 6? And maybe we should let that question stew and tackle it in more detail in the future. But at the very least, it gives me the feeling that we are, in a single night, in the span of a few hours, we are so much closer to knowing the identity of the Montreal Canadiens as a playoff contender a few years from now than we were just mere hours ago.
One thing that I like about this pick, and the fact that he's kind of projectable out a couple years through development, is I think it's important to not make a mistake that a certain team in Eastern Ontario has made, where they kind of decided these were their guys and they want everyone to be in this kind of small, tight age group, and to kind of lose the spectrum of you want players across ages on your team. The Canadiens have done a really smart job, I find, of keeping Brendan Gallagher and David Savard and Mike Matheson and Samuel Montembeault on the team. They have that nucleus of guys 20 to 24, and what they're starting to do, and I hope they keep doing it for as long as they can. Eventually, they're going to have to start trading these firsts.
Yep.
That's just how it works.
Yep.
But for the time being, hold on to it so that you know that when we get to 3 or 4 years from now, we'll be able to say, oh, that's right, Michael Hage is in Laval, we can bring him up. Just make sure for as long as they possibly can, keep drafting these guys and keep developing them and taking your time with them, because you need to make sure you have a nice long tail so that you have it seems like they have their core offensively and defensively, and in terms of Jacob Fowler in net in theory. And I know Demidov is also 18, but the idea is you want to make sure that it's not just a group of 4 or 5 years. That's important. They have the older guys that are there, and whether or not they get traded in the next 6 months or 12 months or 24 months, there is a 26 to 34-year-old, 35-year-old group. And I think importantly, it's going to be, they want to make sure it's crucial that they have, and they have tons of draft picks in 2025 as well. Keep that pipeline as consistent as you can for as long as you can. Eventually, when we get to 26 and to 27, they're going to start trading these draft picks out.
Right.
So I think,
and also those draft picks will be lower down in the draft anyway.
Exactly.
So you're not going to get a Hage with a 28, let's say, or 25,
or 32.
Yeah. Hopefully. That would be great. President's Trophy winners.
That's just the other thing I wanted to mention. I'd like how they're just keep these picks. It's okay sometimes. I know people maybe initially wanted them to trade it. I think everyone's fairly happy with Michael Hage, like you mentioned. So just, keep the prospects coming in, a few every year.
Yeah.
And that's how you build long-term and sustainable success.
And that's what we all want. And on that topic of trading, where historically, we saw with the Doc trade, the New Hook trade, taking draft picks and going towards, we don't necessarily want a 17, 18-year-old. We want to get guys that fit into the, 22 to 24 age group. Such was the case with both of those guys. So it's nice to see that that there's variation on that. They don't have to do that every single year. That's not the only ingredient that Team Hugo has to build their team. They're interested in also drafting talent that's going to be only good in a couple. Like Demidov is not in next year, right? Contractually obligated to play in Russia. So the year after he comes in, and then maybe Hage is a year after that or 2 years after that. So continual improvement based on these prospects coming in. And then there's the ones we already have, which are, very exciting. The Becks, the Mayshars, we've already sort of scratched the surface with him. So just, again, rounding out this young crop of forwards. We haven't even talked about the Ds yet, but
So like the worst thing you could do as a general manager, president of hockey operations, is to have one idea and continually try to execute that. What is much better is to continually assess your options and act accordingly. We talked about in our previous episodes, what is Kent Hughes and Jeff Gordon's pattern? The pattern was two things. One was drafting European players in your first round, which, hey, 1 for 2.
Yep.
Hage becomes the first non-European player that they draft in the first round. So they broke out of that. There was definitely some. They could have picked Chernyshov. There's a few other players on the board, Solberg as well. And then the other one was to consolidate draft picks, which they did, but usually to pick up another player. And in this sense, they probably scanned the market. They looked around and they said, hey, you know what? We really like Michael Hage. We're going to do that. So it's okay to have ideologies. It's okay to have ways in which you want to approach something, but don't get locked into it, because what an idea that was once good is not always good. So I really appreciate that. They very much seem to be thinking on their feet, assessing options, seeing opportunities as they come, and then attacking them. And I think that's what they did with this first round with both Demidov and Hage.
And as things change and they use these other apparatuses to gain talent, you have to wonder if next year is the year that they employ the free agency route, because they've done basically everything else. They've traded for high talent. They've drafted for high talent now, exceedingly high talent in the case of Demidov, which I've got 2 fun questions for you shortly, Jordan, that I think our listeners are going to enjoy. But I do think that as early as next year, the free agency route becomes a real possibility, and this team becomes competitive quite soon, but then also has this crop of young guys who can then come in and just fill in those little gaps and help out this team in many ways. So I think drastic improvement on the power play, on offense in general, in the top 6/top 9, depending on what you believe in terms of Hage. So just exceptional stuff. Are you ready to get into those 2 questions?
Yeah, I think so. Like for Hage, we'll revisit him. We'll do a deeper dive. Obviously, like we were able to look at Demidov a lot more in preparation for this. Hage, there's so many players that they might take in the 20s. I know I didn't do as deep of a dive on Hage relative to the guys at the top of the draft, so we'll come back to Hage.
Yeah.
We'll talk about him even more. We're very excited about it. But yeah, let's get into those Demidov questions to kind of wrap up what the Habs did on day 1 of the draft.
Yeah, Hage is definitely worthy of more deliberation, but let's get into those questions. So the first one I want to ask you, this is the most excited you've been about a Montreal Canadiens draft pick since who?
So I racked my brain on this one. There's really only 2 names that come to mind. Now, like I was happy when they drafted Lane Hudson, but it was more like, hey, look, this fun guy fell to us at the end of the second round. That's cool. But it wasn't like the level of excitement with Demidov. So the only 2 names that came to mind was Caulfield in 2019 and Galchenyuk in 2012. And it's funny. It's the same thing, right? Like Caulfield was a guy falling who has tons of offensive talent. And Galchenyuk at the time, well, he didn't fall. Like that was basically like the mock was always going Galchenyuk 3, but it was very much like super talented center drafted by the Montreal Canadiens. So it's funny. It's always like a skilled forward, something we've been dying for 30 years from a draft pick perspective. So those are the 2 names. Look, again, the Galchenyuk one, people might like kind of look at me sideways on, but I'm promising you in the moment, we were all pumped.
Yeah, absolutely.
For Galchenyuk at 3. What about you? What names did you find?
So Caulfield, for sure. I thought about Galchenyuk, but Caulfield was higher up for me because you're absolutely right. Just seeing him fall so far and then falling into the Montreal Canadiens' lap, that was huge. Slavkovsky was the other one for me because for months prior to the 2022 draft, I wanted Slav and I wanted him on the Suzuki and Caulfield line. Like I saw that coming years in advance, and so that was very exciting to me. But at no point did I believe that Slafkovsky would have, and not to say that he doesn't, but at the time I didn't think that he would have 100-point potential the way that I really think that Demidov does. And so since Mats Naslund, the Montreal Canadiens have not had a 100-point player. That's about 30-something years. What was it, 91? I don't even remember, 92. It was before my time. So since then, the Montreal Canadiens have not had a 100-point player. Since Kovalev, the Habs have not had an 80-point player. So this, to me, is just exceedingly exciting with Demidov. And so I would have to say that he's the most exciting draft pick that they've made, in my opinion, in my lifetime. Yeah, because Caulfield was exciting, Slafkovsky was exciting, but Demidov is, and maybe that's because we have a podcast now that we do all this research for, and so we watch tons of tape going in. So like maybe the fact that we know so much about this player means that we're that much more excited about having him.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to put that stuff aside and just think as a fan, and the things that he does with his hands just make me jump over the moon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was trying to think too, like, you brought up Kovalev, and Kovalev's obviously not a draft pick, and other high-producing forwards, I'm thinking of Nick Suzuki, also not a draft pick.
Right.
So it's Saku Koivu and it's Max Pacioretty. I think those are the two best, at least high-round, like first or second round offensive talents that they've drafted in the past 30 years.
If you count later rounds, I mean, the second round Subban, you could throw in offensive talent, but as a defenseman,
it's a little bit different.
But top end of the draft, you're definitely right. It's those two guys.
Yeah.
And Galchenyuk showed a flash, and then didn't work out as much.
Okay, what was your second question?
So second question: why did the second best player drop to 5?
This is interesting. I think almost unanimously he was viewed as the number 2 guy before the draft lottery. And then the draft lottery happens, and I think a lot of places kept them at 2 for a little bit. And I remember like one of the first mock drafts had TJ Ginla going to the Habs at 5 because Demidov was assumed to go 2 to Chicago. And then the rumblings about Levshunov going 2 instead of Demidov started maybe a week or so after. So Chicago at that point it seemed like Chicago was good with that. I think when in doubt, teams lean center over winger. So that kind of explains why Lindstrom.
Yep.
And which again, something I was willing to argue about a month ago that I would take Lindstrom over Demidov. Seneca's the weird one, quite frankly. Like we viewed group like 2 to 4 as a tier, basically. It was Ivan Demidov, it was Caden Lindstrom, and it was Artem Levshunov in that order. Again, it took me a while, but like that's what I think we both landed on the exact same order there. Seneca, that's all the Habs needed, right? The Habs needed one team, Anaheim or Columbus likely, to pick someone else. And it was Beckett Seneca going to Anaheim. So a weird set of circumstances. I don't know. Do you have an answer for it? Have you been able to I know it's 10:30 p.m. now on draft night. Like the draft is still going on. We haven't had too much time to process it. But why do you think Ivan Demidov fell to number 5?
So it is the players drafted above him. You're absolutely right that is a huge factor. It's the Russian factor as well, as much as that's, I think, much less of an issue than, not to bring him up again, but Michkov was, because that was more years on the contract. But look, the Russian factor, whether it actually is a real factor anymore, it's still in GM's minds, so maybe that had something to do with it.
Just to jump in on the Russian factor thing, I think it's maybe a little bit less on like, oh no, that player's in Russia, we don't know if they'll come over, and more about like, we can't get scouts to watch them.
Which, fair enough. That's totally fair.
I think it's almost like we're changing the Russian factor description. I think that's what's happening.
Right.
It's less about like, I don't know if this guy's going to come over. I know that was like technically what people kept saying about Michkov, even though tons of different reporting about him. I think it's more about like, we don't have people watching the games in person. There's only so much you can get from like a YouTube video.
Yep.
I mean, I know they're watching the actual games, but I think that might be part of it. Where like, I mean, the Canadiens might be different. They probably, I believe they do have Russian scouts. So like, but not all teams do, and not all teams have those resources to have scouts or that the pre-existing connections prior to the invasion of Ukraine. Not to make this all geopolitical, but like, because you can't do it now. You can't be like, okay, we are the Utah Hockey Club, we're going to go put scouts in Russia. I don't think you can do that now. If you had pre-existing relationships, it's probably different. And the Habs, obviously, with Nick Bobrov, seem to be okay with that. So I wonder if that's like the new Russian, like Russian Factor 2.0.
That's
almost.
very astute. I think you're probably right about that. Though I will say in the case of Demidov, whether you're watching him in person or on YouTube, he's just as flashy. So whether they had a scout in the building or not, they were probably like, whoa. My screen, did you turn the brightness up? Because that was quite a flash. And that happens on every play with him. So, I think that's probably very true, Jordan. It wasn't in your initial analysis, but me mentioning the Russian factor made that flash in your mind to mention another flash. But that's probably a very good point.
And you're about to say also about Caden Lindstrom.
Yeah, thank you. So back on Caden Lindstrom, we had both said that without the injury, he's in the conversation for number 2.
Right.
So finding out that the injury really isn't that bad, actually, which seems to be the consensus now that some news has come out, that totally makes sense. So him going above him makes sense. Lev Shinov going above him makes sense, where Chicago needs that number 1 defenseman, and Lev Shinov looks like the real deal, so fair enough. So absolutely it is Seneca going above. So, again, to talk about Grant McHagg, who right after it happened tweeted out, "I'm so upset that Montreal Canadiens didn't get Seneca at 5." So still just sort of
let him have it. It's okay. He got the Seneca thing. He wanted Surin to go to the Habs pick in the 20s, and Surin actually went 22nd. So another win for Grant McHagg. What can you do?
Yeah, he's on the ball.
So then last thing on Demidov, it's just a quote from his agent, which I believe he provided a few weeks back, essentially saying, again, this is his agent, so it's not just a grain of salt, it's all the salt, that, and I think we said something about this with Matvei Michkov last year, of if he was playing in the CHL, he think he would have been challenging for the number 1 pick. And this is how we end the Ivan Demidov chapter for now. We will find out in the next 3 to 5 years very much how, we have all been patient on Slav. We got to continue to be patient on Slav. Same goes for David Reinbacher. Same goes for Philip Machar. Let's give all these players time. But that's an interesting quote that I'm going to keep in my head.
Yeah.
About, is Ivan Demidov, should he have been the top pick? Or at least the consensus second pick? Anything else on Demidov before we turn the page?
No, I'm just happy.
We're pumped here. Okay, so
that's all.
Let's start wrapping up our coverage of draft night. Well, obviously, we'll be back in a few days to recap the entire draft. The Habs a little later on picks on day 2, but I'm sure they'll still be able to grab some beauties. They obviously Jacob Fowler and Florian Jacki were day 2 picks, and Lane Hudson and Adam Engstrom were day 2 picks. So they're still going to get great players. But to wrap up day 1, Brian, let's do some quick winners and losers of the draft so far. Again, it looks like EJ Emery just went 30th overall. So it's not quite done yet, but I think done enough that we can start wrapping this up. I have 2 winners and 2 losers, non-Montreal Canadiens division, and kept them out of it for this one. So winner number 1 for me, if you don't mind, I'll go first.
Please.
It has to be the San Jose Sharks.
Yes.
Macklin Celebrini, and then Sam Dickinson at 11, a player who I had inside my top 10. I think you kind of just outside, but that's because you had a left-handed defenseman bias in your analysis.
That's correct.
Which you have fully admitted to, which is totally okay. I think we can move on from that bias next year, I hope.
Well, the GMs seem to share it based on 3 righties going before any lefty did.
Absolutely. And so San Jose now making the Dickinson over Bouillon pick, I thought was a little interesting, but not overly surprising. I'm sure if you polled all the scouts in the NHL, you'd probably get, I would assume, a 70-30 split for Bouillon. But Dickinson at 11, great value on a pick that you acquired earlier, which I know in part 1 of the episode I was kind of not sure about what they were doing with that pick. It worked out. There was a top 12 of the 6 defensemen and 6 forwards, and they went all in the top 12. So San Jose grabbing that from 14 to 11, good on them. You did it. You are one of the winners of my draft. What do you got, Brian?
So the first one I'll talk about, I wasn't planning on talking about them first, but it's related to what you just talked about. It is Zeev Bouillon going to Minnesota. So the very last opportunity to get somebody in those top 12, and they get Zeev Bouillon, who we both believed would go probably more like top 6, 7, something like that. So just a dynamic offensive talent. They showed the graphic of him going up against the likes of Makar and Hughes and these amazing defensemen. So a really amazing pick for Minnesota. So just with that one pick in the first round, I think that they're definitely winners. Another team that picked twice, just like the Sharks, was Utah, and they did very well. So Iginla at 6, I love this pick. I think that that's proper value right around the right spot. And then Baudouin at 24. So both of these guys have that dog in them. This is going to be a mean team when both of these players are in their top 6, assuming Baudouin gets their worst case top 9, and then either way, they're crushing you into the board. So I really like that for Utah.
All right, just to jump back in, we mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I think you got to put the New York Islanders as one of the winners.
Yeah.
They're kind of just sitting in place, and I think overcoming an organizational blind spot with usually, again, drafting more low ceiling, high floor players. They got Cole Yzerman. They got the best shooter in the draft at number 20. Remember how that worked out for the Canadiens when they did the same thing in 2019 with another Cole from the USN TDP. So good job, Islanders. We wish it would have been the Habs. And honestly, like if that would have happened, the Habs would be at the top of the winners list across
of course.
the board, I'm pretty sure. Again, Hage, still great, but there is a slight tier change with Yzerman there at 20. So, yeah, great on the Islanders. Any other winners for you?
Absolutely. Well, so picks 25 and 26, I think, are winners. One of them because it's the exact guy that they want, and that's the Boston Bruins getting Dean Letourneau, just a huge dude who's punishing. So that's right in the Bruins handbook. So that's less of a global winner and more of just they like that guy a lot. But Liam Greentree going 26 to the Kings. That's a steal in my book.
It's a guy who fell, unsurprisingly.
Should have been end of the lottery, I think. So
we were talking about this for a while, that he was going to fall, that I thought he had legitimate top 10 potential in terms of skill, in terms of like in a vacuum. Yeah. I think he's top 10. I didn't put him top 10 if we stopped at that number, but like he would have been in like the 14, 15 range, maybe 13 for me, behind like Salayev and Yzerman and maybe Hellenius. Like I'm very open at that point at number 13. Him falling all the way to what was initially the Habs pick about 24 hours ago. Great pickup for the Kings. Like, well done.
Yeah.
Enjoy Darcy Kemper.
100%.
So for losers,
yes,
I have two right now. So one has to be, we talked about Bouillon going number 12 to Minnesota, the team that traded out of that spot, which is the Philadelphia Flyers, which it's okay if like, you didn't like Zeev Bouillon, whatever. Jet Luchenko at 13, I think is a massive reach. It's not the biggest reach of the night. That's going to go to the next team I'm going to speak about. But I don't know, like Luchenko at 13 when you're passing on Zeev Bouillon, to me, we'll see. Like we talked about Luchenko, that we were like pretty fond of him after the U18s, and that was a guy that maybe the Habs could be targeting at 26, but he seemed to be rising last minute. Well, he rose all the way to 13. I don't know. That's a weird one. Passing on Bouillon for Jet Luchenko.
Super weird. I think. Well, they were fielding many calls. They were making many calls at that point, and I think ideally in their minds they didn't necessarily want to drop back one spot. They probably wanted to drop back like 6 or 7 spots, get way more capital in another means, whether that's players or more likely other picks later on. But they only moved back one spot, and then they probably just said, you know what, we'll just take the guy that we like. So I agree with you. I think Bouillon just pick him. If I'm them.
Yeah.
But look, they wanted Luchenko. They got a little bit of capital later, and they'll use that for something else. So yeah, definitely a loser there. The one I thought of, which we've kind of addressed, was Seneca going to Anaheim, and I don't even know if I want to call that a loser because he's gonna be great.
Yeah, I don't think it's a loser. It's a reach. But
yeah,
like we talked about it a bit briefly offline, but just maybe for the listener, I think the thought process here was they really liked Seneca. And they knew that Columbus was locked in on Lindstrom. They knew that they knew that Chicago was obviously locked in on Levshunov, which meant that Demidov's going to fall to 5 and that the Habs were cool with that. So you didn't have a natural trade partner at 4 or 5.
Correct.
And then I think what happens is they knew Utah would have wanted Seneca.
Okay.
So there is no universe where you could trade down and still get Seneca.
Okay, so just take him. So don't risk it.
Again, I'm trying to rationalize in my head. I think that's what happened.
That makes a lot of sense, and if that's what it is, fair enough.
Yeah.
It just seems like a leap because we both had him like 8, 9. I think you had him 8, I had him 9. So like going up to 3 seems like a little bit of a leap, but he was also in that same tier as Iginla and all these other guys. So perhaps I shouldn't call it a loser so much as I don't understand it that much.
Last one I had, just the biggest reach of the first round, Tarek Parashak, number 17, to the Washington Capitals. Fine player, just not one I think you needed to take in the first round. Definitely one. I would assume definitely one you could have traded out of 10 to 12 slots. So we saw a lot of trades in the 20s with teams picking up additional capital. I think the Caps probably could have gotten away with that, but so I think it was the biggest reach, I think easily, of the first round.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I don't see many draft guides that had him even close to that number. So yeah, fair enough. I don't really have any other losers here. I think that the draft kind of went status quo for the most part. Maybe the most status quo pick is going to come up in our next segment when we talk about our Atlantic rivals and who they picked.
Yeah,
in the first round.
Let's get right into that, Brian. Can you summarize, just so we're keeping tabs? So obviously Panthers, Lightning don't have first round picks.
Correct.
So those are easy, quick checks. Who do we got next?
So the first one was us, obviously, with Demidov at 5, and then 2 picks later, Carter Yakimchuk goes to the Ottawa Senators. So right-handed D, good amount of talent there. I think that they were probably thrilled with that pick, and we're going to be seeing a lot of him. And then after that, after the trade with the Sharks, Buffalo goes down to 14 instead of their 11 pick, and they get Konsta Helenius, which I think is a very fair pick in that range as well. That's a great one. 1 pick later, the Detroit Red Wings pick the most, and this is the one I was talking about as completely status quo, European high floor player for the Detroit Red Wings. What else is new? Michael Brandt-Signaegard. He's going to be great. This is a guy that I really was kind of hoping would fall to 21. This was one of the ones that I had on my list of like, he's going to be awesome. Put him with Owen Beck and have one of the best defensive lines.
So I think that one, and you are my witness to it, I called Brandt-Signaegard at 15, and I called Trevor Connolly.
You called both.
Going 19 to Vegas. So proud of myself for those 2 picks because I recognize I said Seneca, I believe, was going to Buffalo with the 11 pick about a month ago. Boy, was I wrong with that one. So I just want to get some street cred back on those 2 picks.
You got more right than wrong, I think.
So anything else from the Atlantic Division?
Yeah.
I mean, like sorry, you can go ahead. Run through what the other picks were.
Yeah, so there's just 2 more. So at 25, Boston, Dean Letourneau.
Yeah.
I mentioned him already. Bruiser, huge dude. They're thrilled to have him, I'm sure. And then Toronto at 31 drafts Ben Danford. This was a guy that I talked about very, very briefly when we talked about our pick at 26 and who might be available there, and the right-handed defenseman, and he's one of them. So I'm sure Toronto's thrilled with that. So no incredibly high upside players. Maybe Letourneau would be that, and Dickinson, I would say. I suppose Yakimchuk as well, but like the Habs made out the best of anybody in the Atlantic. I mean, we had the highest pick, so you would expect that.
Yeah.
But even in terms of where you're picking, I think that the Habs got away with murder, getting both Hage and Demidov compared to these other teams in the Atlantic. What do you notice about this group here? Who picked who?
I mean, good on Ottawa. We're going to get to the Ullmark stuff just briefly in a few minutes, I'm sure. Good draft time for the Ottawa Senators. Everyone knows that they have good players at forward. I think there's still question marks about how it all fits together at forward, but they definitely have talent there. The deficiencies on that team are defense and goaltending, and I think they addressed definitely the goaltending, although there's one big caveat on that. And I think Yakimchuk is just a great pick. He went 7th, not how high I would have had him. I would have taken Zeev Buium, I would have taken Zane Parak, I would have taken almost all the other guys in that group, maybe other than Salayev. Like Salayev and Yakimchuk probably for me were a coin toss. So good stuff on them to make that pick, I think. And then I know you mentioned, I know it's getting late, we're getting tired a bit. You mentioned Dickinson again. Remember the picks got swapped.
Yes, it's Helenius.
It's Helenius, which I mean, like I think the point still stands. Like that's a good value pick.
Absolutely.
Whether it's Dickinson or I mean it's actually Helenius, but like good job Buffalo. Like well done with that. And then I do think, Letourneau. That's a Boston guy that I think they'll see in 3 years. He might be a complete flop, but when you're picking at 25, I think that's a perfectly fine proposition. So,
and that's what they get for the Ullmark move.
Yeah, exactly. So they got back into the first round, and maybe we can start unless you have anything else to say about the Atlantic Division.
No, not really. I mean, I'm happy that none of them picked a guy that I'm scared of.
Exactly.
Say.
Yeah. So I think we can wrap up on any other big moves that happened during the draft or in and around the draft, before the draft in Vegas. We've talked about it a bunch of times at this point, a reference that Linus Ullmark trade to Ottawa. So Korpisalo and the number 25 pick going to Boston, Linus Ullmark going to Ottawa. Ottawa is retaining 25% of Korpisalo's salary, which is not nothing. The big caveat here that I mentioned is Ullmark still needs a contract extension. He has 1 year left. I cannot fathom Ottawa for a third straight year making a mistake on a 1 year deal, whether it's Alex DeBrincat or Vladimir Tarasenko and now Linus Ullmark. I hope it's a really bad pattern if that happens, but if he stays and he's good, then I think it's a worthwhile move for them.
Yeah, if they squander this one too, that's just appallingly bad for that squad. And although they're rivals, I don't think that that's the way that you want them to be.
No,
You want the Canadiens to beat them on the ice, not beat themselves because they can't sign the guys they trade for or acquire. So, we're not really wishing that on Ottawa. What other moves were interesting, Jordan?
So the other one, and this was Leafs fans. So UC Saros.
Yes.
This was a name thrown around, I think, by a lot of Leafs fans when they got eliminated, and they're like, "Hey, it's time, guys." You know how the Sens every year say this is the year for them making the playoffs?
Yep.
Every spring, Leafs fans say this is the year about trading Mitch Marner. So this year, they said, boy, you know what's a great fit? UC Saros. Marner, Saros, straight up.
1 for 1.
1 for 1. And I'm guessing that, I don't know, like Nashville, like there's the Askarov part, which I'm sure we'll get into in a second, but like they're just like, nope, we like UC Saros. We think we're a good team. Let's lock them up. We can talk about the Leafs angle, which again is like kind of tangential to it, but like I think really good value for UC Saros. 8 years at 7.7 something, 7.1, I think. It's a random number. That's his own number and all that, but
yeah, 774, I think. That's he's number 74.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty damn good value. Like we're gonna see the big Igor Shesterkin's next contract is gonna be insane.
Yeah, well,
So-
that'll set the tone for what an elite goaltender makes in this league. What one of the best goaltenders makes in this league.
So
I think the UC Saros one is fair. It's good value now. Whether it's good value several years from now, maybe they don't care because, like you said, they're trying to compete now, and that's the other reason that Askarov is now potentially on the trading block. I say potentially he's on the trading block because you're not going to keep him as a backup for 7 years. This highly touted goaltending prospect who's supposed to be just a brilliant player, like you're not going to keep him as a backup. And is there a universe in which they trade him away and one of the best future goalies goes to another team and just is exceptional and elite and they're kicking themselves?
yeah,
Depends what they get back, I suppose.
I will say now that the draft and the Oilers just made their pick, so I think we're really coming towards the end of the draft here. Very interesting that not a peep on McGroarty.
Yeah, nothing.
Like we recognized in the last episode, like Winnipeg can afford to be patient with this for a variety of reasons, but really not a peep about Askarov. There was the rumors a year ago about, I believe it was, I forget. It was the Nashville pick plus Askarov for the Habs pick at 5. That was a rumor that went around the draft last season. I didn't hear much about it this year. Apparently the Habs were approached by many teams about the number 5 pick, but once they knew it was Demidov, like they were not moving a pick.
Yeah, forget about it.
Yeah, nothing on Askarov. I don't know how they keep him in. I think it's Milwaukee, their AHL team, for a whole season. I think he's clearly ready. He's one of the best, if not the best, goaltending prospect.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's not in the NHL.
He deserves a jump.
Yeah.
He deserves to get a real shot now, and I think he'd do well with a real shot. So here's to hoping he gets it.
Agreed. The only other move I had, I guess, like one thing is like I mentioned Marner there. Like it seems like the Leafs are not going to make any moves.
Status
on that.
quo.
Just good. Well done. We'll
run it again.
run it up. So we don't have to talk Leafs. It's the Stamkos stuff. That's the only other bit I had.
Yes.
That it seems like, and this all can change, and we usually try to avoid stuff that has like a short shelf life, but it seems like Steven Stamkos is going to head to free agency, at least in some capacity. That, I don't know, it's weird, and not that we have to care much about Stamkos leaving, but it's weird when a guy's been at a team for 15 years, won a couple cups, arguably the best player in franchise history, although like they got, for a short franchise history, like I got some absolute killers on that team.
Stars, yeah.
But he's been the face of the franchise for a decade plus, along with Victor Hedman. I find it weird that they're openly leaking that, like, yep, Victor Hedman extension coming July 1st because he has one more year on the contract, but they're playing a bit of a hardball with Stamkos. What do you think about it?
It makes me feel weird inside to say it in a non-formal way that he's not going to be a Lightning.
Yeah.
You know, he's not going to be a Bolt. Stamkos has been forever. I thought he'd end his career there, even if it meant taking less money to try and go for a cup again. If it means he's going to go to free agency and go to another team and have another shot with a team that respects him and respects his value, then good for him. So on that front, I think it's cool. So it's hard to find. Like I don't know if it's out there or not, but we weren't able to find what the contract that was actually offered to him was, and so whether or not that they view him for what he's worth or not, who the heck knows, but supposedly there were ties to Detroit which could be interesting. I don't know how much
Yeah.
truth there is, or if that's just rumors swirling around as they tend to do this time of year. But
I mean,
it's an interesting fit.
Detroit's cleared a lot of cap room, so that
Yep.
would make a lot of sense, which is probably why it's being connected there. My hunch would be that they offered him 2 or 3 years at 6 or 7 million, and he wants 4 years at least 8 million.
Which, hey, you're Steven Stamkos, you can ask for that.
They call up Ken Hughes. Is Hughes okay with that contract? 4 years, 8 million a year.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so because of the age.
Right.
Talk to me in a year with Draisaitl or somebody else, or if it's slightly less years but a little bit more money, then that's like if it's 9 million and 2 years. But you're right. Now that's silly. He wants the term. He wants to play several more years.
I think he wants the biggest total dollar amount.
Yeah.
So I think if he's getting like 18 to 20 million from Tampa, and another team will come in, I'm talking total contract, right?
Yeah.
And another team comes in and offers something closer to 30, I think that'll make a difference. I think if it's relatively close, like maybe you get Tampa to add a third year, but it's at like 6 million or 6.5, and another team has, I don't know, 3 years at 7.5, and all of a sudden the difference is like over the entire length of the contract, maybe 2 or 3, maybe that'll be okay. Like I do think Tampa wins like they get him back if it's a close deal, but if Tampa's off by like 8 to 10 million total contract value, then we'll see.
Yeah, and look, you can talk about it as being sort of heartless to the guy who's been the face of your franchise forever, but at the same time, what often wins cups is the ability to move off of players before they've run out of their prime. And not that Stamkos has yet, but who's to say that a year or two from now he doesn't slow down the way that Ovechkin is starting to? Another guy who just seems timeless and ageless, but Father Time gets everybody.
Yeah.
There's nobody who avoids him. And so eventually these players who are gods just become sort of average guys and then become less than that. And you don't want to give a guy $8-9 million for several years if you think that by the third, fourth year of that deal, it looks sour. So
I do think if the Habs are 1 more year advanced in the rebuild, this would be a more legitimate conversation, but I agree. It probably just doesn't make sense to spend that capital right now. Any other stuff from the draft thus far that you want to discuss before we wrap?
Well, just as a side note, we mentioned Detroit. There was the tidbit about Wallman being packaged with a second just to get rid of that deal, and then it surfaced that teams would have been interested in giving assets for Wallman, so like they basically paid to get rid of a guy that had value. So that's kind of funny to me. Like that's a blunder.
You gotta do your homework.
Yeah. Not much else from my perspective. I'm still on cloud nine. Maybe I'm forgetting something obvious.
No, like there's the Mangiapane move, but like who cares?
Yeah.
So no, I don't think there's anything else really worth discussing. We'll see when we come back for our next episode if anything else has really happened.
I am so psyched next episode to talk big picture with these acquisitions in the draft, and obviously everybody who's going to come on. Like this is day 1 of the draft. Day 2 might have some fun surprises for the Montreal Canadiens too.
I think so. We'll see who they pick up. We'll be excited to talk about it. So we'll be back in a few days to talk about that. Until then, you can follow us on social media at HabsLandPod. And yeah, this has been a blast. Thank you all for listening. And until next time, go Habs.